No one mentioned what had just happened. Conversations slowly restarted, like a machine turning back on. Someone laughed a little too loudly. Another person reached for their phone. It was as if skipping my name had already been absorbed into the evening. He leaned back in his chair, relaxed now. The moment had passed for him. For me, it hadn't even settled yet. I listened to the conversation without joining it. Stories, plans, small talk that filled space but meant nothing. He answered questions about work, about travel, about things that made him sound important. No one asked me anything, not because they were rude, because they assumed I wasn't supposed to be part of it. That assumption sat heavier than the silence. I noticed how easily people adjusted, how quickly they took cues from him. When he spoke, they leaned in. When he laughed, they smiled. When he ignored me, they did too. I lowered my eyes to my plate, not because I was ashamed, but because I wanted to see how far this would go. He spoke to the person on my other side, without acknowledging the space between us. His arm rested on the back of his chair, not mine. It was subtle, clean, comfortable. That no one mentioned what had just happened. Conversation slowly restarted, like a machine turning back on. Someone laughed a little too loudly. Another person reached for their phone. It was as if skipping my name had already been absorbed into the evening. He leaned back in his chair, relaxed now. The moment had passed for him. For me, it hadn't even settled yet. I listened to the conversation without joining it. Stories, plans, small talk that filled space but meant nothing. He answered questions about work, about travel, about things that made him sound important. No one asked me anything, not because they were rude, because they assumed I wasn't supposed to be part of it. That assumption sat heavier than the silence. I noticed how easily people adjusted, how quickly they took cues from him. When he spoke, they leaned in. When he laughed, they smiled. When he ignored me, they did too. I lowered my eyes to my plate, not because I was ashamed, but because I wanted to see how far this would go. He spoke to the person on my other side without acknowledging the space between us. His arm rested on the back of his chair, not mine. It was subtle, clean, comfortable. That's what made it dangerous. That's when I realized I started noticing details I had ignored before. Not big things, small, quiet ones. The way he leaned toward other people, but never toward me. How his voice softened for them, sharpened for everyone else, and went neutral around me. I watched where his attention went when someone new joined the table, who he looked at first, who he checked in with. It wasn't me. I told myself it was nothing, that couples don't need constant acknowledgement, but something felt off. I noticed how he answered questions about our plans without looking at me, as if my presence wasn't required to confirm them. Someone asked about an upcoming trip. He responded immediately. I hadn't known we'd decided on that. I stayed quiet. Not because I agreed, but because I wanted to see how many choices would be made without me noticing. He laughed at a story someone told, a real laugh, the kind that lingers. I couldn't remember the last time he'd laughed like that with me. That's when I realized this wasn't about the dinner. It was a pattern. The pattern became clearer the longer I watched. It wasn't what he said next. It was who he said it to. He leaned slightly toward the woman across from us when she spoke. Not enough for anyone to comment, just enough to notice. I watched the space between them close, while the space between us stayed the same. He asked her a question, listened carefully, nodded. When I spoke earlier, he hadn't asked anything. I stayed quiet and watched how naturally it happened, how smooth it looked from the outside. Someone made a joke about how attentive he was. He smiled, modest, like it wasn't intentional. No one looked at me. I told myself not to jump to conclusions. Comparison can distort things. But then it happened again. He remembered how she liked her coffee, asked if she still preferred it the same way. I didn't remember the last time he'd asked me anything like that. I adjusted my napkin and kept my eyes on the table, not because I was hurt, but because I didn't want my face to give me away. This wasn't dramatic. That's what made it unsettling. No raised voices, no obvious disrespect, just a steady redirection of attention. The difference was subtle, but it was consistent. I noticed the comment came back to me suddenly. Not because of what he said, but because of when he said it. Months earlier, we'd been standing in the kitchen. Nothing dramatic, just a normal evening. He'd been talking about work, about people I hadn't met yet, names I didn't recognize. At the time, I was barely listening. Then he said it, casually, almost joking. I remembered smiling and brushing it off, telling myself I was overthinking. Now, sitting at that table, the memory felt heavier. I watched him as he spoke again, confident, assured, comfortable being the center of attention. He hadn't changed his tone since then. I just hadn't noticed. Someone asked a question that should have been directed at both of us. He answered alone. I let him. I wanted to hear how he would explain us without me. He spoke in general terms, used I instead of we. No one corrected it. I noticed how natural it sounded coming from him, how easily it landed with everyone else. I lowered my eyes to my plate again, not to avoid the moment, but to listen more carefully. This wasn't new. It had been forming quietly long before tonight. That's when I realized I hadn't ignored the warning, I'd misunderstood it. The memory sharpened. Stopped listening to the conversation. Not because it didn't matter, but because I had heard enough. Once you understand a pattern, repetition stops being useful. I focused instead on my own breathing. Slow, even. He didn't notice. He was still comfortable, still confident, still speaking as if the evening belonged to him. That told me something important. People don't change behavior they believe has no cost. I watched the way he spoke about the future, plans, decisions. All of them sounded settled, final, as if there was no need to check with me. I didn't interrupt. I wanted to see how far the assumption went. Someone asked about our schedule next month. He answered immediately. I hadn't agreed to any of it. I didn't correct him, not because I didn't care, but because correcting him would have been easy, too easy. I realized then that my silence wasn't confusion anymore. It was choice. That's when I understood something had already shifted, quietly. I leaned back slightly in my chair, adjusted my posture. For the first time that evening, I felt steady. He reached for my glass to move it aside, without asking. The familiarity of the gesture stood out. He still thought access meant permission. I let him finish speaking, because people reveal more when they believe they're in control. I noticed how often he used certainty in his language. The check hadn't come yet, but the evening was already ending. People began talking about schedules, early mornings, traffic, work the next day. He nodded along, relaxed, like the night had gone exactly as planned. That was when I realized something. He believed this version of the evening would stand, that it would fade into memory as normal. He leaned toward me slightly and asked, quietly, if I was ready to go. It was the first thing he'd said directly to me all night. I looked at him for a second longer than necessary, not with anger, not with confusion, with clarity. I nodded. We stood up. Chairs moved back. Goodbyes started. Someone thanked him for organizing dinner. Another person commented on how smoothly everything had gone. He smiled and accepted it. No one looked at me. I didn't correct that either. Outside, the air felt cooler, cleaner. We walked side by side to the car without speaking. He unlocked the door and held it open for me, a familiar gesture, practiced and automatic. I paused before getting in, not to create drama, not to make a point, just long enough to feel the weight of the choice I was making. I understood something then. The next morning, I didn't bring it up. Not at breakfast, not when he checked his phone, not when he talked about his day. He didn't mention dinner either. That told me everything. People only avoid conversations they're not prepared to have. I moved through the day slowly, deliberately, not rehearsing words, not building a case, just paying attention to how often I'd adjusted myself to fit the space he left, to how easily I'd accepted being quiet to keep things smooth. By the afternoon, I knew what I wasn't going to do. I wasn't going to argue. I wasn't going to demand explanations. I wasn't going to ask to be seen. That evening, I packed a small bag. Nothing dramatic, nothing rushed, just the things that were mine. When he noticed, he asked where I was going. I looked at him calmly and said I needed some time. He laughed lightly, like it wasn't serious. That was the moment I felt nothing at all. No anger, no sadness, just certainty. I left without raising my voice, without listing reasons, without asking him to understand, because I already